The great thing about a mirror is that it shows you when there's something wrong. The only problem is the mirror can't fix what's wrong. So if my hair's all sticking up and I've got chocolate all over my face, the mirror will show me, but it can't fix my hair for me. It can't wash my face. And anyway, a mirror can only show me what's wrong on the outside. It can't show me what's going on inside. It can't look into my heart. But God has given us a mirror that gets beyond what's on the outside and looks right into our hearts, reflecting what's hidden there so that we can see what's wrong. He's given us a mirror that shows us the truth about ourselves, and that mirror is God's law, summed up in the 10 Commandments. Now, maybe you think that sounds a bit odd. Maybe you think the 10 Commandments are all about external things. Maybe you think of them just as a giant list of do's and don'ts. But Jesus tells us that they go much deeper than what's on the outside. He sums up the 10 Commandments in 2. 1, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And 2, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. According to Jesus, the commandments are all rooted in what we love. They're rooted in our hearts, in the very centre of our being. And breaking the commandments, Jesus says, isn't merely an external thing, but it's something that flows out from our hearts. For, says Jesus, out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. That's Matthew chapter 15, verse 19. In fact, Jesus says that these sins don't just come out of our hearts, but they begin in our hearts as well. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us how the commandments against murder and adultery are broken before anything happens on the outside. Anger, Jesus declares, is murder in the heart. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And lust, Jesus says, is adultery in the heart. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So the commandments get right to the heart of things. As a mirror for our hearts, they show us the truth about ourselves by showing us our sin. But like any mirror, the 10 Commandments can only reflect what's there. They can't fix what they show us. And so through God's law, we're shown our sin and our need for someone to fix what we see. But who? Well, the first commandment gives us the answer. It says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. First, the Lord God saves from bondage. Then he calls upon people to trust in him as the one and only God. And if we look honestly in the mirror of the 10 Commandments, we see that we are in bondage, not a physical bondage. There aren't chains around our ankles or bars on our doors and windows, but we're in a bondage on the inside, a bondage in our hearts. How do the 10 Commandments show us that? Well, by showing us our sin and letting us see that no matter how hard we try, no matter how much effort we put in, we can't escape from its entanglements. No matter how badly we want to be good, sin holds its sway over us. But the God who gives the 10 Commandments is the God who sets people free from bondage. And knowing who he is might help us understand how. For the book of Jude tells us that it was Jesus who saved the people out of the land of Egypt. Jesus is the Lord our God who brings people out of bondage. Jesus is the Lord our God who gives these commandments and calls upon us to worship him. The mirror of God's law shows us our sin and our need for a solution, but the law can't deliver us from bondage to sin. Only Jesus can, and he will. He set the children of Israel free from their bondage in Egypt through the death of a Passover lamb in their place. And he sets us free from slavery to sin by dying for us as our Passover lamb in our place. Jesus can save you from slavery to sin, and he will. Trust in him, and he'll lift you out of the bondage of darkness and bring you into his glorious kingdom of light. Trust in him, and he'll give you a new heart, a heart set free from this slavery to sin. And for those whose hearts have been set free by Jesus from this slavery to sin, the mirror of the Ten Commandments now also becomes a window through which we can see God's will for his people. Now that we've become God's people through salvation from sin in Jesus, the commandments guide us by showing us what a life of loving God and loving our neighbour looks like. And now, the law is no longer just a mirror on the outside, but God writes it in our hearts as he fills us with love and gives us his Spirit. As we read in Romans chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, "For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." So the law functions as a mirror, showing us our sin, and for believers, as a window into God's will for how we live as his people. But it's also a promise. Shall and shall not aren't just words of conviction and instruction. They're also words of future promise. The promise of what life will be like in God's eternal kingdom, where we will all perfectly love God and our neighbour. And so the Ten Commandments aren't a list of hopeless ideals for a non-existent perfect world. No, they are a promise of the perfect world which is to come.